안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. Nice to see everyone. I love Korea, love Seoul. Wish I was there. Thank you, Eric, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm a co-founder and former CEO of Kickstarter, and also a experienced entrepreneur and angel investor, and someone that works with a lot of startups. So happy to have this conversation and have some helpful thoughts for the Korean startup community, especially.
Yeah, so of course the Kickstarter is very famous around the world, but why don't you start with the brief introduction of Kickstarter first?
Yeah, sure. Kickstarter pioneered crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, as you probably know, is a lot of people pulling together money to make something happen. In the case of Kickstarter, it's making creative projects, making technology, making movies, opening restaurants. But crowdfunding is also charitable projects. GoFundMe is a big platform for that. And crowdfunding has also become how creators are being supported in an ongoing way through subscriptions. And so it's really grown to be a big space, but all of that began with the model that we built and pioneered. And Kickstarter now is 11 years in, and $5 billion have been distributed to entrepreneurs and artists through the platform in the last decade.
Well, 5 billion was the size to distribute to many projects.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Because during these 10 to 15 years, so many things have changed. Because the concept of the crowdfunding, when the concept come to the market, many investors, especially the institutional investors, don't believe that this kind of the platform is gonna success, because many VC or private equity, any institutional investors think that we need some expertise to look at the startups or many projects, because we need to deep dive to the more information of the startups or project, because the founders have more information. So these kind of things make us have some expertise to look at and due diligence of the project or company. But anyway, the crowdfunding is a kind of mainstream of the concept of investment. So in that sense, how do you think the biggest difference between institutional investment and the crowdfunding platforms?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that there's the difference is in motivation. For an institutional investor, for a VC, you are meeting that entrepreneur, you're doing that diligence, thinking about a return, an exit, an eventual outcome. Even if you meet someone that has a product that you imagine might work, you as an investor still have to ask yourself, well, but to what degree will it work? What are the competitors? There's a lot of things that you're having to ask yourself. For a crowdfunding project, and this was quite intentional for us, there is no profit motive. There is no diligence being done from the perspective of, well, I make out well on this. There is the diligence of, does this person seem like they know what they're doing? Do they have a track record? Is there enough? Do they show enough to make me believe in them? It's a much lower bar. Most Kickstarter projects would be bad businesses. And they don't aspire to be good businesses. Someone who makes and self-publishes comic books, even if they're successful, that is a hard business to model on. But what it does reveal is how much opportunity and how much meaning there is for creating projects that don't reach a 10x, 100x scale and don't even aspire to, but instead just engage the internet to a large degree and just like, hey, let's be the thing that people think is cool today. And there is a lot of energy and a lot of churn and a lot of interest in that. And there's just only looking at project ideas from a financial lens creates an extraordinarily narrow view of what a good idea is. It's like the thinnest sliver of what fits as a good idea. But when you're asked to judge an idea based on its creativity, its story, do people care? Does it seem like something that people would want? It's a very different kind of answer. just speak about it on like what kinds of projects. I mean, I think that there is something interesting in, so there have been extraordinarily successful companies that started on Kickstarter. Oculus started on Kickstarter. Pebble invented smartwatches through Kickstarter. Peloton started on Kickstarter. Like there have been industry-changing projects and products that began there. What's interesting is that a number of those products were massive successes. Pebble raised something like $30 or $40 million on Kickstarter through crowdfunding, but ultimately that ended up provoking Apple to even go harder at the Apple Watch. And ultimately that space got squeezed by bigger players. So what you see is that people are going to Kickstarter with early ideas. Those ideas might turn into great businesses. Oculus gets bought for $2 billion, Peloton, a very successful IPO. But at the time they're launching on Kickstarter, they were more in the case of Oculus, literally a teenager in his garage phase of their project development. And so those are the ones that have worked out extraordinarily well. But I think most VCs are getting the deal flow of high potential, high maximizing types of projects. But what VCs don't, think about, and what it's not their jobs to think about, is that there's just a huge swath of things that don't fit that model, but are still interesting for other reasons.
Oh, by the way, really, you can also ask the question freely, because we don't need to separate this session. All together, we discuss together. If you have any question, no? Because very few chance to discuss with founder,
Go ahead, please. I'd love to hear.
No, I'm very interested in this session, because when I was in the French government, I was the person who created the regulation for crowdfunding to introduce crowdfunding in France. So of course, Kickstarter was a huge source of inspiration for what I did, and it was very complicated at that time because, of course, especially for crowd lending, because there are different types of crowdfunding. There are crowd investing, crowd lending, etc. And for crowd lending, I remember there was a very strong resistance of the institutional banks because they didn't want their monopoly of lending to be broken. And they saw crowdfunding, crowd lending as a threat. And I remember that I had to face this. So I think it's very interesting also to say to entrepreneurs or to people who have projects they would want to crowdfund, to have a look at the regulation in their countries, because depending on where they are, they could easily or not so easily have access to this kind of financing. And it's true that it's great because it creates a space for projects that could actually, we will discuss VC later, but could not be financed by other means. So I think when I did the regulation, I was very interested, especially in that freedom that it gives to some project and the ability to make some projects come to reality, and it would not be possible without crowdfunding. So sorry, it was not a question, it was just a commentary.
No, I really appreciate that. And I remember those regulations, and when Kickstarter launched in France, we spent a lot of time making sure that wanting to do that the right way, and still have a great team of people there. I think it's super interesting, and that one of the benefits that's obvious now, but maybe we still take for granted, is just the benefits of the public nature of crowdfunding and allowing the public to be a part of your story from early on, and how much that speaks to the currency of the web and just what the fandom of the web is like, the kind of ownership people feel over projects and stars that they love, and how that has evolved into subscription funding with Patreon, where you have a lot of people whose livelihoods are just being supported. They're being paid rent by their fans. And even that, you even see that model coming to like pornography with OnlyFans, like this sort of like peer-to-peer direct pornography site that is actually also using this model at this point. So there's something really interesting there. And comparing it to crowd lending is also interesting, because a lot of those big crowd lending platforms, studies later found that a lot of the money coming into them was actually coming from those institutional banks. That by the time those got big enough, like all the smart people with a lot of money were like, hey, there's a pretty good return here. Let's like maximize this, and as much as we can, to where actually like the peer-to-peerness of it was became less true as they grew bigger, just because money was looking for, just a way to make money. But these smaller communities and artists owning a fan base of 1,000 people and being paid $10,000 a month to just do whatever they want, it definitely has ties to the old patronage systems, but that's a fundamentally different kind of relationship and a hard one for others to intermediate. And so I think it marks, and we're seeing it happen with paid communities now too, which is another new space of the web where you're seeing people using money to create different shared goals and using the architecture of the web to make that connection. I think the direct individual and collective funding space is like still comically early, and that, by the time, 30 years from now, like, I just think that this is just going to keep growing, and that we still underestimate the potential of the space.
Okay, so why don't we discuss about more practical figures and what is a Kickstarter is? Could you please share the average size of the project in the Kickstarter, and what is the average numbers of people who are applying to each project? Yeah.
So I haven't been CEO for a couple of years, so asterisk on all my numbers.
It's okay. So gut feeling is okay.
Yeah. So, the average project is probably raising about $12,000, and part of that is that you have a category like music where the average project is raising $2,000, and then you have a category like technology where maybe the average raise is more like $40,000, $50,000. The average pledge amount is $70. So the math you're always trying to do to figure out either how much you can raise or how many people you need is you just have your funding goal, your budget that you're trying to reach, you divide it by 70, and that's generally how many people you're going to have to get to be a part of it. For the typical project, about 60% of their funding will come from an existing network. 40% will come from people who find the project on Kickstarter. Really, I think the language of having success is all about like looking at what other projects are doing at the moment. It's such a peer-to-peer environment where everyone just steals the best ideas from each other's videos. Just like, oh, I like how they did that, I'll do that. So I think thinking about the tone and the story of your project, which on all of these crowdfunding platforms, like the story and narrative of why someone should care, why someone should be excited is so much of what makes people engage. Fairly professional videos have become a norm. You don't have to do that, but that certainly does stand out. And depending on your category, projects routinely raise millions of dollars. Certainly there was a point where maybe someone would think, is this project too big for a Kickstarter? But the largest projects have raised tens of millions of dollars at this point. And so that scale of project is possible, especially if it's something that the public would be really excited about.
Very interesting point that the 60% of the investment comes from the existing networks, which means that what type of the person is reliant to the Kickstarters, mostly investment side?
Who is like going to Kickstarter, hanging out on Kickstarter, you mean?
Yeah, who is so what is the characteristic or main themes of investor of Kickstarter? Because you told that 60% is existing networks.
Yeah, so 40% are people who just spend their time on Kickstarter supporting projects. These are hyper early adopters, people that they don't just want to know about the thing first, they want to be the first one that ever like greenlit it. These are people that are especially obsessive about technology, about games. Kickstarter is the largest tabletop game publisher in the world. Like tabletop games is $1 billion business that no one realizes because each project on its own doesn't seem that big, but it's in a massive space. And so, it starts there.
Okay, interesting. One of the beauty of the Kickstarter is not only getting investors, but also possible to get you told me that the early adopters, which means that there are customers so many customers up there. At the same time, the customer is the investor, right?
Yes.
Yeah, all these questions and discussion behind here is I'm trying to explain the Kickstarter, explain to potential client of the Kickstarter in Korea or any client in Asia. Try to client means that they want to launching their projects to the Kickstarter platform. So in that sense, what kind of the project manager or what type of the project is one of the best solution to the Kickstarter?
Yeah. Well, one just to say that the people who support Kickstarter projects, they're called backers. They are not investors. They're putting up money, but they are not getting an ownership stake. They are getting a copy of what's being made or to be a part of the project in some way. But I would say the categories that are most active, the technology, hardware product category continues to be one that people love. And you are always seeing lots of nascent new products being launched there. So I think technology is strong. Games is huge. Kickstarter had a very successful launch in Japan a couple of years ago, and games was a big focus of that. And then, the other bread and butter of Kickstarter are artistic and creative projects. So the overwhelming majority of projects are people making movies, making albums, writing books, things like that. And there is a big audience of those folks. But those projects, aren't as big in terms of funding as a product where you'll have a wider group of people who will buy into it.
Okay, yeah, very good. Because I'm the VC guy, so it's very difficult to invest or judge to what kind of project of movie, music, contents, game is best. But the Kickstarter could be one of the best platforms to understand not what kind of project is success, but what kind of project is preferred by the many people. If the many people prefer the project, maybe they motivated to deploy their money to this project, and then so automatically those kind of collective peoples turns to be fans of each project. That is a kind of ecosystem of Kickstarter, I think. So,
yes, that's right.
So this kind of peerization, peer-to-peer platform, how do you look at the near futures of the Kickstarter's kind of expansion or different type of the platforms to another project?
I think Kickstarter will continue to serve creative projects, and I think Kickstarter will continue to be largely the same platform. We were always inspired by Craigslist at the start, just the idea of a product that knows what it is and doesn't try to be anything other than that. But as I said before, I think that the crowdfunding and just direct support we're only at the beginning, because in the film and music worlds, there are the equivalents of VCs. There are record executives, executives at Netflix who greenlight projects, who decide what it can be made or not made. And those systems work well for the benefit of those systems, but for all of the artists or all the entrepreneurs who want to do things, who get told no, who don't fit whatever that definition is, this is a place for them to go directly to the public and to not need permission. And so I think, especially after COVID, I believe that we're in a post-permission society where really nobody knows anything about what's going on, and just acting with confidence and some boldness is especially rewarded. And so I think these kinds of spaces that are allowing an individual team or a person or an artist to make their ask, to not run it through a gauntlet of other people's opinions, I think we're going to see that more and more become the norm and a dominant way of operating.
Okay, and because some of audience here, so I would like to get the questions.
Maybe one question. You were mentioning that crowdfunding is probably at the beginning, not at the beginning, but still a lot of time ahead. What new trends, you mentioned them briefly, but what new trends do you see arriving in the coming years? Maybe some have already come because of COVID. How do you see the next five to 10 years?
Yeah, well, there's going to, I mean, we're seeing it now with, say, musicians. The end of live music, right, has left this enormous gap in the music industry where, like, how is that meant to be closed? In the past, that was a fan buying a ticket, an experience. You know, there was a set theater that allowed for that transaction to happen. We're going to have to redefine those spaces, you know, and that is happening through COVID. It's all still a bit awkward. But I think that will be one big thing. You know, I think that the rolling fund trend on Twitter, I don't know if you've seen this, but Twitter personalities starting their own public VC funds, where they're doing public fundraising and putting money in as an angel, but creating like a Twitter army of, hey, we're 5,000 people and we're this early stage LP fund together. We're only going to invest in, you know, crypto projects that do X. Like, I'm beginning to see this, that basically there's enough money, especially if you're in the top 20 percentile, there's enough money sloshing around. There's enough money available that I'm seeing more and more people act as a kind of venture capitalist or a kind of grantee, and in doing so at smaller scales, and really seemingly without, you know, the returns just almost being secondary to like just the internet hype of doing something together. And this has all been post-COVID. I think Robinhood, you know, the rise of Robinhood traders is maybe a part of this too. But there is a very different relationship to money that I feel like is happening. And in a way, like, money is becoming more important, but also like kind of not, like, people are just throwing it around in a strange way. So I don't know. I think that there's a real deep transformation that I look at, you know, I mentioned OnlyFans, like the porn peer-to-peer site, but like, I think that's really important, really important. And so, yeah, I just think individual stories controlling, guiding audiences, that is like, it's hard to bet against that. It's just gonna be what platform has the new form that, you know, is the sexiest way to tell that story now. But I think that's a good space to be in.
Yeah, very interesting. It's a very similar story with how the BTS is successful in the world. Individual story to the mass people is one of the biggest success point, KSF of Kickstarter's, how my project is successfully raising all target size, right? Yeah, that was my question, last question. What is the biggest tips to successfully raising up the all size of the fund from the Kickstarter?
Well, I think you have to know your moment to raise. You know, if you go too early, you're only going to be able to convince people who already know you. If you are farther along in the project, if you have a trailer that looks like a movie, if you have a nice demo of something, you're going to be able to get strangers. So a lot of it's going to be, what is that moment in the life cycle? How much seed capital do you have? How much can you show, depending on where you are? And these projects work best when you are thinking of those backers as community members, as people who are like joining the team and could even have some forms of responsibility. You can ask them to do things with you, you know, and projects that step into that engage in that way, that speak to the community as they like to be spoken to, do phenomenally. And so I think that there's just a mindset where you're not going in to get money. You're there to get people. You're there to get attention, and then you're there to execute. You know, because the public nature also means like you have to execute well. If you don't, everybody knows. Like everybody knows every mistake you make. So, you know, execute well. But the rewards are extraordinary, and this kind of working in public is, you know, it's just going to more and more be the norm.